Hey, I'm back with another read aloud, so follow along if you're reading with me. We'll get through this in the 5 minutes I have to record it, so let's get going. We're talking about Darwin's theory. Darwin's theory. So the voyage begins in 1831. Charles Darwin was a well known scientist. In 1831, he joined a ship whose task was to map the South American coastline. Darwin saw creatures that he had never seen before. He found fossils of organisms that no longer exist. On the Galapagos Islands, Darwin saw that there were giant tortoises that looked different on different islands. He could figure out which one of the islands they lived on just based on the features he could observe. What adaptations were observable? Galapagos tortoises that live on wetter islands look different than those who live on drier islands. Tortoises that live on wetter islands with lots of vegetation have domed or rounded shells and short necks. Tortoises that live on more desert like islands have a shell with a high curve in the front. The high curve allows the tortoise to stretch its long neck up to reach the scarce vegetation. Both tortoises have adaptations that are well suited for their environment they live in. The only natural predator of tortoises on the Galapagos is the Galapagos hawk. It only preys on very young tortoises. Tucking into its shell probably doesn't help the young tortoises, as the hawk is strong enough to pick them up, the small tortoise, and tear it apart. Some species of animals were introduced to the Galapagos Islands, but were not native there. Those species, like rats and pigs, eat tortoise eggs. Darwin realized the same observations could be made about finches. He could tell which islands they lived on based on the varieties of their beaks. He described 14 different finch species. Finch species with big, thick beaks were seed eaters. Those with very thin beaks were insect eaters. They were also fruit eaters and cactus eaters. Back in England, Darwin pondered his findings and did some experiments of his own. Some experiments were embryology. Some experiments were in artificial selection of traits. Darwin bred pigeons and found that he could produce different traits, like the color or characteristics of their feathers, through careful selection of the pigeons he bred. Making sense of Darwin's observations. Darwin thought that natural selection could explain how organisms had changed over time. He defined natural selection as a natural process resulting in the evolution of organisms best adapted to their environment. Darwin's observations and experiments gave him the evidence to support his theory. But 20 years after his journey, Darwin still had not announced his theory of evolution by natural selection. Most people in Darwin's day thought that all different types of animals and plants had been created simultaneously and that they had not changed all since that time. He hesitated to announce his theory because he knew that his ideas would go against the beliefs of most people had at the time. Eventually, another observer, Alfred Wallace, contacted Darwin. Wallace had independently come to the same conclusions Darwin had been mulling over for decades, noticing the adaptations of organisms that were a result of the environment they lived in. Shortly afterwards, Darwin published his work as a whole entitled On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. Alrighty, let's answer those reading questions. And remember, you can check back through this reading assignment to help yourself answer those things. Thanks for listening.